Hi class, and welcome back to another lecture for social psychology. Today we're going to be going over chapter 5, social attribution. Now this I think is a really useful chapter in your own life because we'll talk about how we can attribute and maybe misattribute certain details to different individuals, ourselves, other people, and things of that nature. And it's a really good way to kind of take a look at yourself and see if what you're always saying is exactly correct or what we would say is rational. So I definitely think that this will be a useful lecture for you, for those of you who think social psychology is useful, and I hope that's all of you. But a couple quick announcements. Stop by office hours, Tuesdays and Thursdays from 11:30 to 12:30. Also come by for an appointment. You can shoot me an email for that. Also remember, check your syllabus and Blackboard for other assignments. Those are being posted when they need to be, and you guys should be keeping up with them. But other than that, let's start with this idea of cause and effect. Right? We use what we call causal reasoning to make sense of our world. Right? If I were to drop a pen, right, and it makes a loud noise, right, we would say that the pen that dropped was the cause of that loud noise. And that is what we are talking about here. And the idea is that we use causal attribution. We attribute things to cause and effect. We link an event to a cause. And normally that's really good, but sometimes this includes things like personality traits being responsible for a behavior, right? So the idea of, in one example here, that A causes B. If it rained last night and we had a wet floor this morning, right, what happened? Well, we'd say it's probably that the rain caused the wet floor. But when we talk about people, we might have a different question here. What I want you guys to recognize is, for instance, if I describe a student that I may have had in the past who is never showing up to class, and when they do, they're always late, they're never answering questions, they're not paying attention, they seem to be sleeping, their assignments are slipping, they're not doing well. Most people, when I ask them to describe that student, would describe a lazy student. But what I also tell them to think about is, right, are they sure that that personality trait is responsible for the behavior? Or could it be the fact that this person is going to actually be taking care of their family? Right, and maybe trying to help their family by working a second job and also going to school, or working one job and going to school can be a lot for some people in college because college is a full-time job. But it's the idea that we try to use cause and effect, and maybe we're not always good at it. So when dealing with ourselves and others, how do we do these different things? How do we draw inferences about the causes of behaviors? How do we explain our own behaviors, and how do we explain others' behaviors? And are they the same? No. And then how do we use these explanations in our judgments, right? How do we decide what, kind of people we are working with or meeting or dealing with? How do we attribute these things to them, right? And then even a better question, why do we want or need to explain other people's behavior? It's not our behavior. Well, let's talk about attribution theory, or the idea that a set of concepts explaining how people assign causes to people and events and the effects of these kind of causal assessments. So attribution theory is this big, long definition that I like to shorten down to how people explain the causes of their own and other people's behaviors, and then the outcomes of those explanations as well. So maybe you want to use this kind of shorter definition. I think we get kind of the same thing, right? Why people do what they do, right? And what they're going to do in the future. That's a big part of what we want to know. Why is it that, right, some people will park like this, right? Why do they park like this? And then we might want to know, if you're lazy today, are you going to be lazy tomorrow? Or if you are the guy who parks like this, are you the type of guy who's lazy? So attribution theory is right, finding different attributes or kind of more or less, how would I say this, kind of characteristics of other people. And so how do we explain other people's behaviors? Well, one thing that we're going to talk about during this chapter, right, is, well, first we want to determine why people do what they do. And this is called attribution theory. We can also talk about, whether attributions are logical or not. We'll get into that pretty quickly. And then cultural differences we'll also talk about. So this whole chapter is about understanding why we do and why other people do what they do, and how we decide to, check on that, measure that, understand that. And so we're going to get into kind of a meta cognitive thing where we have to understand how people understand others, which is a bit confusing, but let's go on with this. So let's talk about attribution theories from the most basic standpoint, right? Behavior is a function of the person and the environment. Back to square one with psychology or social psychology. So we know that causal attribution is the process of deciding if a behavior was caused more by the person or the environment. And attribution theories of how people explain others and their own behavior are going to help us determine whether we focus more on the P, in this case, the person, or the E, the environment. So, right, the why we do the things we do. Well, we can make attributions for ourselves, right? And we can know that for sure, but we can't exactly be sure why other people did it. Right? For example, why did you get a bad grade on a test? Or why did you get turned down for a date? Or right, why did the instructor think that your essay was great or something? We can make attributions about that for ourselves, but we can't always do that very accurately for other people. And so to kind of give an explanation of that, right, is this idea that back in 1987, Peterson and Barrett asked individuals to imagine some different scenarios. So I don't have any examples of these. Imagine like your bike got stolen, might be a negative scenario, or imagine that you like won tickets in a raffle, might be a positive situation, and then provide a likely cause for why each of these happened. And what you see is that people use specific explanatory styles. So how are the ways in which we explain or attribute these causes of each of these? Well, we can do it in three different ways. We can do it in an internal or external dimension, right? So is this something about yourself, internal, or something about someone else, external? Is this something that we consider stable or unstable? Is this something that will be probably present again in the future or not likely going to happen again? So, right, going to class is going to be stable for the foreseeable future that you are going to at least hopefully attend online lectures. But if you got into a car accident, we would say that's an unstable thing because it's not like you're expecting to get into another car accident anytime soon. Then the last one we can talk about is this global versus specific, or how we can influence, does this influence other areas of life on kind of a global scale regarding you, or specific and only relevant to this one domain, right? So are you only bad at math, or are you just a bad learner? Right? A bad learner, if you called yourself that would be explaining yourself in a global way, versus only being bad at math is that very specific single domain being math. Now, of the three of these, the one that we use the most, and the one I'm going to spend time talking about today, is this internal versus external dimension. So is it about yourself or someone else? And so this was broken down actually a while before by Heider into two general category causes, right? Not just this idea of stable, unstable, and global and specific, but originally just its internal and external. So do you do things, based on a situational perspective, in this external kind of attribution we're talking about, this is going to be situational. So why did I do it? Well, because of the situation, not because of who I am, right? So why did I fail this exam? I'm not going to say it's about me if it's external. I'm going to say I just didn't get enough sleep, right? So that's putting the blame off of me. We can talk about something being about the environment, right? My neighbors were loud and I couldn't sleep last night, or the professor gave too hard of an exam. Right? This is the idea that behavior is primarily caused by the environment, right? That we are externalizing this. It's not what I did. It's not the internal version, but the external, right? Other people's problems. So internal, we consider this dispositional. So when you do good on an exam, you might say, well, that's because I'm smart, and that's a disposition about who you are, right? This is something about that person in particular, you or whoever you are talking about. Right? So an internal attribution of my wife might be, I think she did this because she is a smart person. Right? That's still internal because I'm talking about her internal state, not her and me together. Right? I'm focusing on just her. And then this, of course, is that behavior is primarily caused by P, or the person. So more or less, we can break this down into two ideas here, right? That there is an internal or dispositional attribution where the cause is within that person. And right, this could be personality, it could be the traits that they have, how their mood is, their attitude, versus this external attribution, or based on this situation where the cause is within that situation and the actions of others are more or less causing this. Right, so if you want to, right, if I put together a lecture, right, and it's good, right, a person could say from an internal attribution for me, oh, he must be conscientious about what he's doing. Versus an external attribution could be, well, yeah, he has to do this for his job. And that maybe it's, right, the causes within the situation that I wouldn't put together a good lecture unless it was my job. So this internal is your, right, your attitude, your character, your personality. Where this external is a situation where maybe we believe that most people would act that way in that situation. Let me change my webcam. So with that, right, we might run into a situation where we see Miley doing some kind of different things at different points. So an internal judgment of, right, what is this, like 2016-ish Miley? No, it'd be earlier than that. Is that right? Miley is crazy and gross. She's doing all this terrible stuff, and right, that's a very internal judgment. Versus an external judgment that, right, Miley is a victim of the Hollywood culture. Now, I will say both of these are actually, right, differing the opinions here, right? So that saying that she's internal and gross is actually a negative thing, whereas external, we might say that being a victim of Hollywood culture is something that she didn't have control over, and therefore she's absolved of this. We see the same thing with Siri, right? Being selfish, short-sighted, and mean is one way to explain her, but we can also explain her as a clever woman who was never valued as a girl because of a sexist power structure. Both of those are probably true, but how we decide to attribute different traits, beliefs, thoughts about these people is a huge deal, right? So are you thinking that this is an external thing more, or are you thinking this is an internal thing more? So let's talk about relationships for a moment. So sometimes your partner is good to you and sometimes not. I mean, I don't have that problem actually, but right. So how do you attribute it, right? So if your partner does something good, what's really interesting is research finds that for happy partners, they tend to believe that when their partner does something good, that's because it's who they are. It's an internal trait. Oh, he did the dishes without being asked? Oh, he's just a good husband. Whereas unhappy partners will say, yeah, of course he did the dishes. He knows I'm upset, or he better be doing it right. Or that he's only doing this to score points with me. He's not doing it out of the goodness of his heart. I guess that's more of an internal one as well, but like the situation demands this. Right? So if you bring your spouse flowers or your significant other flowers, a happy partner is going to say, that's very sweet of you. An unhappy partner might be more likely to say, oh, were they having a sale there because you just happen to pick this up? But when a partner does something bad, right, happy partners tend to blame these external judgments. Oh, he forgot to do the laundry today? Well, he must just be really busy. Whereas unhappy partners tend to think that's kind of who their partners are. Oh, he didn't do the laundry today? Well, that's because he's lazy. So this makes a lot of sense, and you can see how even your mood can change the type of attributions that you have. This is a bit more long-term than just a mood have you here, but it's kind of a good way to think about this. So when somebody flies past you on the highway going 90, are you calling them an asshole? Or are you maybe an internal judgment? Or are you maybe thinking, well, what if they have, right, somebody who's really hurt in the car and they're trying to make it to the hospital? That's an external attribution. And that's going to give us a different perspective on that person based on what we think. So when do we make internal or external attributions? Well, that's a really good question. And one way we can think about this is through the correspondent inference theory. So, right, inferring different things about people we are corresponding or speaking to or working with. And this breaks down to a couple different factors. The first one is degree of choice. Is the behavior freely chosen, right? So, for instance, am I doing something because it's what I do, or am I doing something because it's what you're supposed to do? So, for instance, if I was, actually a great example is my background, right? So I'm a nerd. I know that. That's who I am. So what I've done is I freely chose to make my background very Zelda themed. And there is a guitar over there as well. I would also remember that guitar has a cowboy hat on it. Hint, hint. You might want to know that for a question. That there is a cowboy hat on the guitar. Hint, hint. So with that in mind, though, not the cowboy hat, the idea is that we would say that I freely chose to do this. However, some people, on the other hand, if you are stuck working at an office that maybe forces you to wear certain clothes, that's going to be something that you can't freely choose. So, Bob is wearing a tie today. It's like, well, yeah, he has to. That's not really going to tell us much about Bob. We can also talk about expectedness of behavior. So is this behavior consistent or inconsistent with your social role? Now, this is kind of interesting, speaking of what I just talked about. The idea is that people have a lot of expectations or understandings of what a professor is in the day-to-day. My dad thought somebody who didn't go to college that we just sat around all day and thought. I wish. I'm working all day. It's not exactly as easy as you think. But on the same kind of breath, I don't necessarily have my background as kind of what people expect a professor would. Most people would expect my degree up there and maybe a wall filled with books and then this, that, and the other. And call me crazy. I just don't, I don't want to do that. And then the consequences of the behavior is our third kind of way in which we can do this. So is this behavior socially undesirable? Well, I would say it's not socially undesirable. I would say it's definitely different, for instance, my background. But if you are deciding to, do this, for instance, you might be judged a little bit differently. So how do we make these internal or external attributions using these three things? Well, is it yes to all of the above? Is the behavior freely chosen? I did this myself. Is this inconsistent with your social role? Maybe, maybe not. We'll say maybe. And then the consequences. Is it socially undesirable? Well, I don't want to say undesirable, but I don't want to say it's super desirable, It's not exactly the norm. Is that if it's yes to all the above, we would say this is dispositional or internal, right? So if if I have this background, we might say that is a dispositional attribution about me, is that, oh, he's definitely okay with being a nerd. Now, if not, it might be situational or ambiguous, right? What if it was like this for one day, and then the rest of the days it wasn't? You might say, that was probably just a situational factor, obviously. But a good example of this is what if I just you found me in my office just wailing like a baby, right? In a ball, all curled up and crying really hard. Is that behavior freely chosen? Probably. But is this behavior inconsistent with my social role? Yeah. And is this behavior socially undesirable? Well, it's probably not good to cry in front of everybody, but we might say that is actually a situational, depending on if you'd believe that is a freely chosen thing to do. But we might also say we're not really sure. So I think with this correspondent inference theory, what you need to know is, these kind of three specific portions of this, but also understand how they interact with one another. And that's going to be something you also need to know. But beyond that, what's really unique about human beings is that we don't always focus on what did happen. We focus on what could have happened. We might focus on why something happened or what might have happened, and we can think of this as kind of the path less taken or the path more taken. Why did, for instance, why was it that? Oh, let me get my date right. So why is it that in Super Bowl 49, the Seattle Seahawks, my team of choice, lost the game when they threw the ball at the 1 yard line instead of running with the number one? Whatever that position is, clearly a sports fan, number one running back in the league at the time. Why didn't they just run it? That is a question I have wondered more frequently than I would like to, So why did they choose to do this when do this one specific thing instead of doing something else? Well, there's a couple reasons why. One of them we might call the discounting principle. So when we wonder why people do the things they do, we also focus on how it fits with kind of the normal. So imagine that there is a situation that causes a specific behavior to happen, right? For instance, when you go in for a job interview, right, you are probably going to present yourself as a very respectable person, somebody who is going to be a hard worker, somebody who really knows what they're talking about. So with that in mind, should we really trust job interviews to be the best and most true version of who you are? No, of course not. Everybody's going to put on a face for a job interview, and so we might discount that information. We might assign reduced weight to that cause of behavior if other more plausible causes might have produced it. Oh, wow, he seemed like a really nice, friendly man, right? If this was me, it's like, yeah, of course he did. He's on a job interview. He's supposed to do that. But on the other hand, we might use the augmentation principle, right? The reverse of this. We might assign greater weight to a particular cause of behavior if other present causes would produce a different outcome, right? So if you decided to be really, really PDA with your significant other in the job or at your job, people would say, okay, so that's not only right, not normal and probably shouldn't be happening, but now I'm going to say that is probably, you probably really like your significant other because of that. And that's just one example. But looking at it in an interview setting, for instance, right, if you were an interviewer, right, everyone was on their A game today and interviewed well, are they all actually like that? Or are they acting that way to only get a job? I think that's a very clear example of the discounting principle. So that's why I use it again. But the augmentation principle, whoops, is this idea that, hey, right, why would we assign a greater cause to something that maybe shouldn't have happened? And here's a positive example. So if you get a phone call and you say, during an interview, and you say, oh my God, I got to run. Now, that's not normal, right? We would expect most people to look at their phone and be like, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, I'm checking my phone, or, right, your phone should be off, hint, hint, in a job interview. But if you ran out, you might have somebody say, wow, that must have been really important. And I'm going to assign greater weight to the fact that you ran out, not necessarily against your job, but saying that, wow, this must be a really important thing because, as said here, right, most of the time, right, other present causes would produce a different outcome usually, right? Normally, you just know to keep your phone off. But if you run out during a job interview, maybe you know that you really need to, maybe you think that, wow, this person must really have needed to do that. So that's the discounting and augmentation principle, but that's not the only thing we do. We also can imagine alternatives, not just the why things happen, but why things happen the way they did instead of other ways. And this is known as counterfactual thinking. Now, counterfactual thinking are these if-only thoughts that occur about how something could, should, or might have happened instead. Your coulda, shoulda, wouldas, as you will. Oftentimes thought about as if-onlys, and your boy here knows a couple things about counterfactuals. This was my dissertation project with a grand total of 28,186 words. Yes, this was a 142-page document. For those of you interested in getting a PhD, here's a taste of what it looks like. So counterfactuals, right, come oftentimes after negative events. So if you fail an exam, oftentimes what you think is, if only I would have studied harder, I could have gotten an A. Right? You can also think things like, if only I wasn't so stupid, I wouldn't have gotten an A. Or my absolute favorite counterfactual I've ever gotten from a student, if my professor was captured by pirates, I wouldn't have had to take the exam. Now, all of those imaginative alternatives, if they did happen, right, that's correct. But notice what people might be focusing on. Are they focusing on traits and behaviors, right? Studied harder is going to be a behavior. Being stupid is a trait. And then we can also see, right, this person is talking about an external attribution. If my professor wasn't captured by pirates, or maybe in the other case, didn't write such a hard exam, then these are going to be ways in which we can actually amplify our feelings. So an example of this is what we call, example of this is the idea of emotional amplification, right? An increase in emotional reaction to an event that might have happened. So there's a jury study about this, but before I get into this, a really easy way to think about this is, which grade do you think would hurt more to get? So assuming that, an 80 to an 89 is a B, and a 90 to a 100 is an A, which would hurt worse to you? getting a 76 on an exam or a 79 on an exam out of 100. Most people say the 79 is going to hurt worse, even though it's a closer number to 100, but you were so close. You were just about to get that B and you did not. So people often think that that is going to cause, People often think about that and they have a stronger emotional reaction to that rather than the lower number because they almost had it. So now let's talk about the jury study. So this is one of my favorite studies to talk about, this jury study, right? The idea is that they took participants who served on a jury to award a victim compensation, a victim's family compensation. And the idea was people were reading about a plane crash. And so the story goes that the plane crashed and there was 1 or 2 survivors, and that the survivor was trying to hike to safety. And all they did was they said that I think this plane went down in the Alaskan wilderness, and they had to walk 45 miles to get to the nearest town. And all they did was they said that they died either they died 75 miles from the town, so they were right in the middle of nowhere, or they died a quarter of a mile from the town. And what you see is that when people are close to, when people are close to having something happen, they believe it's more likely that it might have happened, and that increases emotional amplification. And they actually award over $160,000 extra dollars to the victims' families to the families of the victims who were close, just a quarter mile away. Now, there's no difference, right? Both groups of people, heard about a plane crash. Both groups of people were talking about somebody who was out in the wilderness trying to survive. The only difference is how close they were to being to town, and people actually think that is going to be worth more money to the family. So that is an example of this idea of emotional amplification. But now we've done a lot about talking about attribution theories, and let's talk about whether attributions are logical or not. They're not. Are attributions always so logical? We already know. But the idea is been demonstrated in a bunch of different ways. One of them is an essay in 1967 about Castro. And so people were asked to read either a pro or anti-Castro essay. And what they did was they told half the people, told half the people that the essay writer freely chose the topic, and the other half that the writer was assigned the topic. So imagine, in a more modern day example, imagine you are against nuclear armament. So you want to see nuclear disarmament. You want to see nukes basically broken down and destroyed. So say that was the topic you were going to write about. Well, what they were, we would say that would be, like anti-nuclear war. I don't want to say the other side's pro-nuclear war, but the point being, so people read either a pro-Castro or an anti-Castro essay, and the only thing that they talked about was whether or not the author made the choice. So, and all the dependent variable was, what was the writer's attitude towards Castro? So what they found was that when participants were told that the author was pro-Castro, about 60% of people, thought that the author was pro-Castro, was for Castro. When they were told that the person was given the choice to do a pro or I'm going to restart this slide. Apologies. So let's talk about the x-axis first. So we've got whether or not the authors chose to do this, or the belief that the authors chose to do this, versus the belief that the authors had no choice to do this. And on our y-axis here, we have our judgment about the author's pro-Castro position. So higher numbers mean more likely to be pro-Castro. So when the participant reads that the author of a pro-Castro essay had the choice to do a pro or anti-Castro essay, we know that they are going to do, we know that they must have some pro-Castro beliefs. On the anti-Castro, we don't see the same thing. Now, on the anti-Castro, we see that people don't think that if you're choosing to write an anti-Castro essay, they assume that you're anti-Castro. Now, we would expect the reverse, or kind of no difference when it's no choice, but no, that's not what we see. What we actually see is the same pattern of results, that even if you are anti-Castro or pro-Castro, depending on what you're writing about, people just assume you agree with that. So, if you were writing about a topic that maybe is very tenuous and you're forced to take a side that maybe you don't agree with, people might still actually believe you agree with that side, right? Unless you're pretty clear up front about that. So, are attributions logical? No, we make this mistake a lot. But not only that, we can call this, in one of the most common ways we talk about this is the idea of a fundamental attribution error. So the idea that we tend to underestimate situational influences or environmental influences, external influences, what have you, and we overestimate the internal or dispositional influences only for other people. So, an example of this is going to be this idea that, let's say you see somebody get a bad grade on an exam in front of you, and you say, wow, that person must not be smart, right? You take a dispositional view of that person's behavior. But if you also got a bad grade on that same exam, you might say, well, I just didn't study enough, right? And that's going to take into consideration the situational influences for you. But for other people, we ignore the situational influences. We just assume that's who they are and what they do. And that's going to be cause us a lot of problems, right? So again, if you see a guy flying down the freeway going like 100 miles an hour, we often think about who they are as a person. He must just be an asshole, or she must just be an asshole. But in fact, we're missing the point of the matter, that these situational influences, they might have somebody in their car who's majorly hurt and needs to get to the hospital. The best one I ever heard is they might really have to use the bathroom. And we might ignore those influences. We often do actually ignore those influences. Then we also have this idea of an actor-observer bias, right? Where we tend to attribute our own behavior to the situation. Well, I didn't do good. That was because, the exam was too hard. But when other people do bad on the exam, we might say, well, they're just not smart. So this is an extension to the fundamental attribution error, where others' behavior is related to internal attributions, but our own behavior is related to external attributions. So let's also talk about another type of bias to add to this, as if they're easy enough. We have the self-serving bias. The idea that we make internal or external attributions for our behavior based on what makes the most sense for us to make us look good, right? So people might recognize this guy, hopefully. But if we do a good thing, right? Say we get an A on an exam. Well, it's because we're smart. Cool. We don't have to think about it anymore. Say we get a bad grade on that exam. It's not a dispositional attribution. We say, I didn't study enough, or the exam was too hard, or the professor doesn't like me, things like that. And you can see this in things like courses, sports, businesses, stuff like this, that people want to maintain this positive image of themselves. And recognize, and what I really want you to recognize with this is the idea that the fundamental attribution error, the actor-observer bias, and the self-serving bias, all three of these are kind of talking about very similar, if not the same things, right? We are talking about internal versus external attributions regarding ourselves versus other people. And know those very well, because they can be a little confusing, and make sure you're well versed on those. So let's do a quick review. The fundamental attribution error, right, is that other people's behavior, when we're looking at that, we focus on internal, not external attributions, right? We consider who they are, not the situation they're in. The actor-observer bias, right, when we're looking at our own behavior, we oftentimes look at external factors. When we look at other people's behavior, we oftentimes look at internal factors. And more specifically, though, we only look at our own behavior as external factors when it's bad. When it's good, we use the self-serving bias. We say, hey, right? Hey, is it a good result? All right, I'm going to take credit. Is it a bad result? No, I'm going to blame something else. So these are going to be very useful. This kind of shortened understanding of this, I think, will be very useful to help you explain the differences between these. Now let's move on to whether attributions are logical in a sense of why we find these differences. Why do we find these differences of things that aren't logic? Well, think about automatic processes, right? We anchor to the person and adjust for the situation. The first time I meet you, I assume that's pretty much who you are, right? Maybe you're really sick that day, maybe you're really nervous, maybe you're really scared, but typically I just assume that's who you are and what you do normally, right? So that is why the anchoring and adjusting heuristic also kind of works here. We can also talk about how that plays a role in impression management, back to chapter 3. This is all coming together, right? Recognizing that all of this stuff is relevant to the other stuff we've been talking about in class. But we can also talk about this two-step attribution process, right? This is automatic, but it doesn't have to be. So we have a behavior that we see somebody do, right? We see somebody drive by us on the highway going stupid fast. But we ID the behavior. We say, wow, that guy's going really fast. Wow, he must be an asshole driver. And we automatically characterize them. Now, what we can do is we can effortlessly adjust for the context, or we just might consider not adjusting and just saying, wow, that must be the way things are. But why? Why does this fundamental attribution error occur? Well, first of all, we can talk about the perceptual salience of information, right? This idea that whatever makes the most sense to us, or whatever we can see that's the easiest, is what's going to be what we use. It's a lot harder to think in detail about things like, well, what if this person has something else going on? It's just easier to say, oh, that must be who they are. It's just a quick and easy way to do that. Not only that, we can talk about this really interesting hypothesis called the just world hypothesis. The idea that people tend to assume that bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people, right? That the world is just, and it is very, it works in a way that, right, people get what they deserve. Or, right, we can even see this with victim blaming, actually. When people evaluate different descriptions of a man who was injured in a traffic accident, they're actually more likely to insult his character and blame him for the accident as the injury descriptions got more serious, right? Suggesting that, hey, maybe the reason you got hurt is because you're a bad person. Well, this helps us rationalize this because we feel like we can predict and control our world, and we can talk about how these are similar to what we call defensive attributions, right? We want to make the world feel like it makes a little bit more sense to us. And so what we might do is try to kind of explain away these negative things in a way that's better for us. But lastly, I want to spend a couple minutes talking about cultural differences here. So how does cultural influence, or how does culture influence how we perceive others? Well, we've talked about this Western independent and Eastern interdependent cultures. But with Western cultures, these are very focused on this individual autonomy, right? The idea that we are self-assured and we are self-contained and we will do things on our own, where Eastern cultures stress this more group autonomy in the sense that the self belongs to the people around us, that we are connected, right? More interdependent. We see a more analytic style of thinking in Western cultures where people focus on the object or person versus a more holistic style of thinking where people focus on the whole picture. What's very interesting about this is that in a couple studies we've seen, people are maybe more interested in the group. So when asked about why this front fish was ahead of every other fish, people in Western cultures typically depicted it as being based on this fish being the leader, this fish was the head of the pack, he was the best fish, whereas in an interdependent culture, they more focused on the whole picture. Well, it seems like everybody is just kind of swimming in this direction up here, so maybe he just happens to be the one in front, right? And that's very different of a way of thinking than maybe a more Western culture. And another study explaining this, talking about this holistic pictures, they asked people in Western and Eastern cultures to describe how happy this person was in the front. Now, what you see here is you see somebody who's pretty happy, and Americans, or individualists, we would say generally, they tended to focus more on that specific person, right? And so they judge this person as being happy. And what you see, though, is that with cultures that are more interdependent, they judge this person as being less happy, or actually possibly meaner, because why is this one person happy, but in the rest of the picture, these people are upset? So what you see here is that Japanese participants judge a happy face surrounded by sad faces as less happy than American participants, and vice versa for sad faces surrounded by happy faces. So more of this holistic idea. So how does culture influence how we explain behavior? Well, in interdependent cultures, people tend to pay more attention to contextual factors. So what is going on in this situation? What are the other people doing? Right? And less likely to make an immediate dispositional inference of why that person is doing that, less likely to say, oh, it's because of these traits. We do see the fundamental attribution error actually being a lot more widespread for Western or independent cultures than Eastern or interdependent cultures as well. With that in mind, here's the announcements again. Feel free to stop by office hours. Make sure you're keeping up on your assignments. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. Stop by office hours as well. Otherwise, have a great day. And yeah, have a great day, I guess.